The Russian Civil War was a multi-party war in the former Russian Empire immediately after the Russian revolutions of 1917, as many factions vied to determine Russia's political future. The two largest combatant groups were the Red Army, fighting for the Bolshevik form of socialism, and the loosely allied forces known as the White Army, which included diverse interests favoring monarchism, capitalism and alternative forms of socialism, each with democratic and anti-democratic variants. In addition, rival militant socialists and non-ideological Green armies fought against both the Bolsheviks and the Whites.Eight. Foreign nations intervened against the Red Army, notably the Allied forces and the pro-German armies. The Red Army defeated the White armed forces of South Russia in Ukraine and the army led by Admiral Alexander Kolchak in Siberia in 1919. The remains of the White forces commanded by Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangel were beaten in Crimea and evacuated in late 1920. Lesser battles of the war continued on the periphery for 2 more years, and minor skirmishes with the remnants of the White forces in the Far East continued well into 1923. Armed national resistance in Central Asia was not completely crushed until 1934. There were an estimated 7 million–12 million casualties during the war, mostly civilians. The Russian Civil War has been described by some as the greatest national catastrophe that Europe had yet seen. Many pro-independence movements emerged after the breakup of the Russian Empire and fought in the war. Several parts of the former Russian Empire, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, were established as sovereign states, with their own civil wars and wars of independence. Some of them re-established their independence previously lost to Russia. The rest of the former Russian Empire was consolidated into the Soviet Union shortly afterwards. Background: February Revolution. After the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the Russian Provisional Government was established during the February Revolution of 1917. Creation of the Red Army. In the wake of the October Revolution, the old Russian Imperial Army had been demobilized. The volunteer-based Red Guard was the Bolsheviks' main military force, augmented by an armed military component of the Cheka, the Bolshevik state security apparatus. In January, after significant reverses in combat, War Commissar Leon Trotsky headed the reorganization of the Red Guard into a workers' and peasants' Red Army. In order to create a more professional fighting force, political commissars were appointed to each unit of the army to maintain morale and ensure loyalty. In June 1918, when it became apparent that a revolutionary army composed solely of workers would be far too small, Trotsky instituted mandatory conscription of the rural peasantry into the Red Army. Opposition of rural Russians to Red Army conscription units was overcome by taking hostages and shooting them when necessary in order to force compliance. Exactly the same practices used by the White Army officers. Former Tsarist officers were utilized as military specialists. Sometimes the families were taken hostage in order to ensure their loyalty. At the start of the war, 3/4 of the Red Army officer corps was composed of former Tsarist officers. By its end, 83% of all Red Army divisional and corps commanders were ex-Tsarist soldiers. Anti-Bolshevik movement. While resistance to the Red Guard began on the very day after the Bolshevik uprising, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the political ban became a catalyst for the formation of anti-Bolshevik groups both inside and outside Russia, pushing them into action against the new regime. A loose confederation of anti-Bolshevik forces aligned against the communist government, including landowners, Republicans, conservatives, middle-class citizens, reactionaries, pro-monarchists, liberals, army generals, non-Bolshevik socialists who still had grievances, and democratic reformists voluntarily united only in their opposition to Bolshevik rule. The military forces, bolstered by forced conscriptions and terror and by foreign influence and led by Gen. Udenich, ADM, Kolchak and Gen. Denikin, became known as the White Movement and controlled significant parts of the former Russian Empire for most of the war. A Ukrainian nationalist movement known as the Green Army was active in Ukraine in the early part of the war. More significant was the emergence of an anarchist political and military movement known as the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, of the anarchist Black Army led by Nestor Makhno. The Black Army, which counted numerous Jews and Ukrainian peasants in its ranks, played a key part in halting Gen. Denikin's White Army offensive towards Moscow during 1919, later ejecting Cossack forces from Crimea. The remoteness of the Volga region, the Ural region, Siberia and the Far East was favorable for the anti-Bolshevik forces, and the Whites set up a number of organizations in the cities of these regions. Some of the military forces were set up on the basis of clandestine offices organizations in the cities. The Czechoslovak Legions had been part of the Russian army and numbered around 30,000 troops by October 1917. They had an agreement with the new Bolshevik government to be evacuated from the Eastern Front via the port of Vladivostok to France. The transport from the Eastern Front to Vladivostok slowed down in the chaos, and the troops became dispersed all along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Under pressure from the Central Powers, Trotsky ordered the disarming and arrest of the legionaries, which created tensions with the Bolsheviks. The Western Allies armed and supported opponents of the Bolsheviks. They were worried about a possible Russo-German alliance. The prospect of the Bolsheviks making good on the threats to default on Imperial Russia's massive foreign loans and that the communist, revolutionary ideas would spread. Hence, many of these countries expressed the support for the Whites, including the provision of troops and supplies. Winston Churchill declared that Bolshevism must be strangled in its cradle. The British and French had supported Russia during World War I on a massive scale with war materials. After the treaty, it looked like much of that material would fall into the hands of the Germans. Under this pretext began Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War, with the United Kingdom and France sending troops into Russian ports. There were violent clashes with troops loyal to the Bolsheviks. The German Empire created several short-lived satellite buffer states within its sphere of influence after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The United Baltic Duchy, Duchy of Courland and Semiglia, Kingdom of Lithuania, Kingdom of Poland, the Belarusian People's Republic, and the Ukrainian state. Following the defeat of Germany in World War I in November 1918, these states were abolished. Finland was the first republic that declared its independence from Russia in December 1917 and established itself in the ensuing Finnish Civil War. From January to May 1918, the Second Polish Republic, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia formed their own armies immediately after the abolition of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and the start of the Soviet westward offensive in November 1918. Geography and chronology. In the European part of Russia, the war was fought across three main fronts: the eastern, the southern and the northwestern. It can also be roughly split into the following periods. The first period lasted from the Revolution until the Armistice. Already on the date of the revolution, Cossack Gen. Kaledin refused to recognize it and assumed full governmental authority in the Don region, where the volunteer army began amassing support. The signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk also resulted in direct Allied intervention in Russia and the arming of military forces opposed to the Bolshevik government. There were also many German commanders who offered support against the Bolsheviks, fearing a confrontation with them was impending as well. During this first period, the Bolsheviks took control of Central Asia out of the hands of the Provisional Government and White Army, setting up a base for the Communist Party in the steppe and Turkestan, where nearly 2 million Russian settlers were located. Most of the fighting in this first period was sporadic, involving only small groups amid a fluid and rapidly shifting strategic scene. Among the antagonists were the Czechs, known as the Czechoslovak Legion or White Czechs, the Poles of the Polish 5th Rifle Division, and the pro-Bolshevik Red Latvian Riflemen. The second period of the war lasted from January to November 1919. At first the White Army's advances from the south, the east and the northwest were successful, forcing the Red Army and its allies back on all three fronts. In July 1919 the Red Army suffered another reverse after a mass defection of units in the Crimea to the anarchist Black Army under Nestor Makhno, enabling anarchist forces to consolidate power in Ukraine. Leon Trotsky soon reformed the Red Army, concluding the first of two military alliances with the anarchists. In June the Red Army first checked Kolchak's advance, after a series of engagements assisted by a Black Army offensive against White's supply lines. The Red Army defeated Denikin's and Yudenuk's armies in October and November. The third period of the war was the extended siege of the last White forces in the Crimea. Gen. Wrangel had gathered the remnants of Denikin's armies, occupying much of the Crimea. An attempted invasion of southern Ukraine was rebuffed by the anarchist Black Army under the command of Nestor Makhno. Pursued into the Crimea by Makhno's troops, Wrangel went over to the defensive in the Crimea. After an abortive move north against the Red Army, Wrangel's troops were forced south by Red Army and Black Army forces. Wrangel and the remains of his army were evacuated to Constantinople in November 1920.